Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 3 of SQL Server. In part 1 of this video series, we have seen how to connect to SQL Server using SQL Server Management Studio, and in part 2 we have seen how to create, alter and drop databases. In this session, we'll learn how to create tables and enforce primary and foreign key constraints between those tables. The aim of this session is basically to create these two tables, TBL person and TBL gender. Now within this TBL person table, I want to mark this ID column as the primary key column, and in TBL gender I want this column to be marked as a primary key column. Now what is the use of primary key? A primary key basically is used to identify uniquely each record in that table. For example, in this TBL person table, if I have two Marys, how do I uniquely identify each one of them? Using this primary key column. So if there is another record for Mary, probably she will have an ID of 7. So 2 is for this Mary, 7 is for another Mary that we are going to have. Okay, so primary key is basically used to uniquely identify each record within that table. Alright, to create a table in SQL Server, we have got two options. One is graphically using SQL Server Management Studio, and the other one is basically to write a query. Now first we will see how to create a table graphically using SQL Server Management Studio. So let's flip back. So now within the databases, in the previous session we have seen how to create a sample database. So if I expand the sample database, you see there's a folder called tables folder, and if I expand that, we don't have any tables yet because we haven't created any. Now if I want to create a new table, I can right click this folder and say new table, and we want to create a TBL person table with these columns: ID, name, email and gender ID. So let's create those. So this is the table designer window. So what's the column name that we want? We want the column name as ID and the data type. Now if you look at the ID, the number, it's a number, it's an integer. So I want the data type to be integer. And should this column allow nulls? No, it shouldn't, because I want this column to uniquely identify each row within this table. So I don't want to allow nulls, so remove that checkbox. And I want this column to be the primary key column of this table. And how do I do that? Right click on that column and select set primary key. Okay, so what have we done? We have created this ID column, we have specified the data type, and we said it's not going to allow nulls, and we marked this column as a primary key column. And what's the next column in our table? Name column. Okay, and the data type of this one is going to be nvarchar, and we also have to specify the length, the number of characters. Let's say I want 50 characters. And do you want to allow nulls? No. Every person in my table needs to have a name, so remove that checkbox. And the next column we have is email, and again this is going to be nvarchar, 50 characters in length, and I don't want to allow nulls. And the final column that we want is the gender ID. Okay, so gender ID is going to be an integer, and I can allow nulls. For example, I don't know the gender of a few people. In that case, their gender ID will be null. Okay, so I want to create this gender ID column. So gender ID, and I want this to be integer, and I want to allow nulls. That's it, we are done. Now right click here and say save table 1, and I want to call this table as TBL person table. So basically what we have done now, we have used the designer and created this TBL person table. So you look at this is the TBL person table, and if you expand that, and if you expand the columns folder, you should see all the columns: ID, name, email, gender ID. And if you look at this, ID column has a key symbol next to that, indicating that this is the primary key. There is also this abbreviated form PK, primary key. It's an integer data type, and it doesn't allow nulls. On the other hand, if you look at gender ID, it's an integer column and it does allow nulls. Alright, so we have just seen how to create a table graphically using the designer. Now let us see how to create this TBL gender table using SQL query. Now in the previous session, when we created a database, we used the command create database name. Now we want to create a table, so we will say create table and the name of the table. So create table, and what's the table that I want to create? TBL gender. Now this table is going to have how many columns? Two columns, ID and gender columns, and we want the ID to be integer column, and we don't want to allow nulls, and we want this column to be the primary key column of this table. So how do we do that? So I want the column as ID and the data type as integer, and I don't want to allow nulls, so not null, and I want this column to be primary key. So primary key, so that's the first column, your name of the column, data type, whether you want to allow nulls or not, and primary key. Now the next column that I want to create is the gender column itself. So gender, and the data type of this column is going to be nvarchar, and I don't want to allow nulls, so not null, and this is not going to be a primary key. And remember, a table can have only one primary key. And now execute this command. So command completed successfully. Now if you come here and refresh the tables folder, you should see TBL gender table. Now interestingly, you don't see the TBL gender table. Why? Because if you look at the database context here, you have created that table. I mean, you have selected here the master table. So when you executed this query, it got executed in the context of the master database. And what's a master database? It's the system database. So if you come here, expand this, you should see TBL gender here, but that's not our intention. We want this table to be created in sample database. So let's get rid of that. So that's why we need to be extremely cautious when executing a query. Are we executing that against the database that we want it to be created, or another database? First, let's get rid of this table. So delete, click OK. So the table is gone. Now to create this table within sample database, you can select the database here, or what you can do is in the script here you can say use sample database, and look at that, sample word is in blue color, meaning it's used like a keyword. So if you want to specify that as the name of the database, put it in a square brackets like this, and then click go. So we are saying use the sample database, go. Now for example, if I am in the master database, if I execute just these two statements, what's going to happen? Look at this, the database is automatically changed. And now if I execute this, what's going to happen? This table will get created in the sample database. So now refresh, and you should see TBL gender table here. And if I expand that, and if I see the columns there, you should see ID is the primary key column. It's an integer data type and doesn't allow nulls, whereas gender is nvarchar 50 and it doesn't allow nulls as well. So what have we done until now? Until now we have created these two tables and marked these two columns as primary keys for these two tables. Okay, now what else we want to do? We know that this gender ID column, we want to mark this gender ID column as the foreign key in this table. So how do we do that? Again, you can do that graphically, or you can do that using a query. First we'll see how to do that graphically, and then we'll use a query. Now what is the advantage of foreign key basically? Let's talk about that practically. First let's create this foreign key relationship, and before that let's enter some data into these tables. Now in the next session we will see how to enter data using queries, but for now we'll use the designer basically to enter data. And to do that, right click on the table and click on edit top 200 rows. Before we do that for TBL person, let's do it for TBL gender. Right click on the table and select edit top 200 rows. Okay, now let's say I want to enter 1 male, 2 is female, let's say. Okay, a simple sample data that I have. Okay, so 1 is male, 2 is female. Now let's do it for TBL person. Edit top 200 rows. Now what do we have here? The ID of the person, name let's say John, his email let's say j@j.com, and his gender ID let's say 1. Okay, now this is fine. So John's gender ID is 1. So what is John's gender? He is a male. Now on the other hand, let's say I enter another person, maybe Mary, and m@m.com, but here I'm saying gender ID is 99. Okay, now look at this, that value is accepted by the SQL Server. Now if somebody asks, okay, can you tell me what is Mary's gender? Now you're looking, okay, Mary's gender ID is 99, and you go to the genders table and you don't have a 99 here. So what is Mary's gender? You don't know. Okay, so basically here the data that you have in the person table is not correct. Okay, somebody maybe by mistake they have entered this 99 and SQL Server accepted that value. So if you look at this data, the database integrity is lost. Your data is not intact. There's something wrong with this data. Okay, but on the other hand, if we have established the relationship between these two tables, the foreign key relationship, it wouldn't have allowed you to enter 99 here. But on the other hand, it would have allowed null. Okay, so if you enter null, okay, what is Mary's gender? It's null, which means we don't know. They haven't provided their gender information. But if somebody is able to enter maybe 99 or 101 like this data doesn't make any sense. Why? Because gender ID 101 does not exist in the genders table. And we don't know what is Mary's gender. So the database integrity is lost. So how do we enforce the database integrity? Using this foreign key relationship, foreign key constraints. So let us see how to add a foreign key constraint. So now let's enter this as null for the time being. Let's close this table. Let's close this table as well. Okay, now what do we want to do? In TBL person table, we want to mark this column as a foreign key constraint. Okay, let's do that graphically. So here TBL person is the foreign key table. This table contains the foreign key, and this foreign key is looking up for values in TBL gender table. So this primary key, the primary key of TBL gender is acting as a foreign key in TBL person table. So primary key table is TBL gender and foreign key table is TBL person. And in TBL person, gender ID column looks up its values in TBL gender table in this ID column. Okay, for example, if I want Martin's gender, okay, Martin's gender ID is 1. So you take this value, go into TBL gender, look in this column, 1 is male. Okay, so this is your primary key table, TBL gender, and your foreign key table is TBL person. Okay, now let's flip back to SQL Server Management Studio. So in the TBL person table, I want this column gender ID to be marked as a foreign key. How do I do that? Right click on the table and select design, and within the designer window of this table, this is the gender ID column that we want to mark as a foreign key. So right click on that and select relationships. So this shows up a foreign key relationships window. Click here, add. Now you should see tables and columns specification here. Click there and you should see an ellipsis button. Click that button. This is where you'll have to specify which is the primary key table, which is the foreign key table. And we know that the primary key table is the TBL gender table. In TBL gender table, I want to look up the ID column, and the foreign key table is TBL person table, and within TBL person table, gender ID is the foreign key column. So click OK. Now if you say close and save the table, what's going to happen? This gender ID will be marked as a foreign key constraint. Okay, but let's do that using a query rather than using the designer. Okay, let's not save this. Okay, if I want to create a foreign key constraint using a query rather than the designer, how do we do that? There is a general formula for that. So alter table and foreign key table. Look at this. Alter table, which table we want to alter? TBL person table. So let's write that. So alter table TBL person. That's the table we want to alter. Why? Because in this table I want to mark gender ID column as the foreign key constraint, as the foreign key column. So alter table TBL person table, and what do I want to do? I want to add a constraint. What type of constraint? Foreign key constraint. Add constraint and then give it a name. So add constraint and give it a name. What is the name of this constraint? I'm creating this foreign key constraint on this TBL person table. So on TBL person, on which column am I creating that? On gender ID column. So gender ID, and this is going to be a foreign key constraint. So that's the name of the constraint. And next, what we need to do, we need to specify which column in this table, and that column, which other table is it going to reference, and which column in that other table. So if you look back, so foreign key, and we need to specify which column in TBL person table is going to be the foreign key. In this TBL person table, gender ID, so we specify gender ID is the column that we want to mark as a foreign key. But then if this is a foreign key, then it has to be a primary key of some other table. So which is that other table in which we have to look up the primary key column? So in our case, it's going to be the TBL gender table. So this column is going to reference TBL gender table and ID column. So references which table? TBL gender, and which column in that table? ID column. So if you look at that primary key column. Alright, so if I execute this query, what's going to happen? It's going to create a foreign key constraint with this name. So execute that. So command completed successfully. Now if I come to the TBL person table, refresh that, and if I expand the TBL person, and if I go into the keys table, look at that, there is this TBL person gender ID FK created. This constraint basically created, foreign key constraint is created. And if you right click on that, and if you say modify, you should see exactly the same thing that we have specified here. And if you come here, tables and column specifications, click the ellipsis button, you should see that the primary key table is TBL gender, and the column is ID, and the foreign key table is TBL person gender ID. So you can do that either graphically or using the designer. Now, do I have to remember this, the syntax of adding a foreign key constraint on top of my head? I would say not really, but you'll have to understand the concept. That's what is important. In your interview, nobody will ask you how to, what is the syntax for adding a foreign key constraint, but they would generally ask you, can you explain the concept of foreign key constraint and why do we use foreign key constraints? That's important to understand. The syntax, you can Google that within 2 minutes. If you search Google, you will get tons of articles explaining you the syntax. So basically what we have done until now is we have created these two tables, marked the ID columns as primary keys for both the tables, and we marked gender ID in TBL person as a foreign key column. Now since we have marked this column as a foreign key column, now this column only allow values if they exist in TBL gender. Otherwise the value doesn't make sense. For example, for Rob, if I enter 99, what is Rob's gender? It doesn't make sense. Okay, so it checks that value when you try to insert or update that, and if that value does not exist in the primary key table, it's going to flag that as an error and that it doesn't allow you to enter. Let's see that in action. For example, let's go to this TBL gender table, and let's say edit top 200 rows, and if you look at gender table, we only have 1 and 2, male and female. And let's go to TBL person table and edit top 200 rows there, and let's say I want to change Mary's gender from null to maybe 99. Okay, and the moment I click away, look at this, no rows updated. The data in row 2 was not committed meaning not saved. Okay, so what's the error? There is a foreign key constraint violation. Okay, so because this 99 does not make sense, okay, so let's enter null, because why? In gender table 99 does not exist. So now your data is being verified because of this foreign key constraint. If somebody tries to enter invalid data accidentally or intentionally, SQL Server is not going to save that data, and instead it throws an error. So now we are able to maintain database integrity. The data now is going to be valid. So foreign key constraint. So what's a foreign key constraint? Basically, we are using foreign key constraint to enforce database integrity. In layman's terms, a foreign key in one table points to a primary key in another table. And the foreign key constraint prevents invalid data from being entered or inserted or updated. Okay, because the values that you enter here should be one of those values present in the primary key column. Okay, otherwise you get an error. Alright, so on this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.